The protocol breach. Ambassador Sarah Chen stared at the holographic display floating above her desk, reading the message for the fourth time. Her office in the United Earth Embassy on Luna offered a spectacular view of Earth rising over the crater rim, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the diplomatic communique that threatened to derail humanity's first major interstellar alliance. "Computer, replay the relevant section," she commanded, her voice steady despite her internal turmoil. The AI obliged. As per ancient Ardanian Protocol 447b, all diplomatic representatives must perform the sacred ground blessing before the High Sovereign. The representative shall kneel and press their forehead to the ground before the sovereign's feet, maintaining contact for precisely 7 heartbeats while reciting the verse of submission. Sarah ran her fingers through her short black hair, a habit from her academy days that surfaced during particularly challenging situations. 20 years of diplomatic service had prepared her for many things, but this was unprecedented. "Ambassador," her AI assistant interrupted. "Director Patterson is requesting an emergency conference with the full diplomatic corps." "Put him through," Sarah replied, straightening her midnight blue uniform. The holographic display transformed into a circular arrangement of faces, the 12 most senior human diplomats in known space. Director Patterson's weathered features dominated the center screen, his expression grave. "I assume you've all reviewed the Ardanian protocols," Patterson began without preamble. "This requirement wasn't mentioned in any of our preliminary discussions over the past 3 years. Ambassador Rodriguez from the Mars colony spoke first. "It's clearly a power play. The Ardanians wait until we're on the verge of signing the trade agreement, then spring this on us. They're testing our limits, or trying to humiliate us," added Ambassador Wong from the Europa station, "making Earth's representative prostrate themselves. The media would have a field day." Sarah listened to her colleagues' debate, her mind racing through possibilities. Something about this situation felt wrong, but not for the reasons being discussed. She pulled up the original Ardanian text, letting the translation algorithm process it again. "Director," she interrupted the heated discussion, "I'd like permission to consult with Kital." The chamber fell silent. Tal was a junior Ardanian diplomat who had spent the past year on Luna, officially as a cultural exchange officer. Unofficially, many suspected they were a member of the Ardanian royal family, gathering intelligence. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Chen. If this is a trap, tipping our hand to their operative could make things worse." Or, Sarah countered, "we could gain valuable insight into what's really happening here. The timing isn't just suspicious, it's odd for the Ardanians. They value precision and clarity in diplomatic matters. This last-minute requirement doesn't fit their pattern." After a moment's consideration, Patterson nodded. "Proceed, but with extreme caution. We have 48 hours before we must respond to their demand. The Council wants this trade agreement, but not at the cost of Earth's dignity." As the conference ended, Sarah was already sending a message to Kital. Within minutes, she received a response agreeing to meet in the embassy's botanical garden, a neutral space designed for informal diplomatic conversations. The garden's artificial lighting simulated Earth's sunset, casting long shadows through the carefully maintained terrestrial and alien flora. Tal was waiting by the koi pond, their iridescent scales catching the fading light. Like all Ardanians, they stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a graceful bearing that made them appear to float rather than walk. "Ambassador Chen," Kital greeted her with the traditional Ardanian gesture, right hand pressed to chest, fingers splayed. "Your message indicated urgency." Sarah returned the gesture before speaking. "Protocol 447b. I need to understand its true significance." Kital's outer eyelids flickered, a sign of surprise or concern in Ardanians. "Ah, you've received the formal requirements for the treaty signing. Why wasn't this mentioned earlier? I studied your diplomatic procedures extensively, yet this protocol wasn't in any of the materials provided." Kital moved to a nearby bench, their movements deliberately slow. "Because, Ambassador, Protocol 447b hasn't been invoked in over 3 centuries. Not since the Unified Colonies War. Sarah's diplomatic instincts fired. What prompted its use then? When factions within the royal court sought to prevent alliance with the unified colonies, they used ancient protocols to. Catal paused, choosing their words carefully. Create obstacles. The pieces began falling into place. You're saying this requirement isn't coming from the High Sovereign. I cannot speak to its origin. Catal replied diplomatically. However, I find it interesting that the protocol notification came through the Office of Traditional Affairs rather than the Royal Diplomatic Service. Sarah's mind raced. The Office of Traditional Affairs was headed by sub-sovereign Valkyr, known for his opposition to expanding trade with Earth. Catal, I need to know, what's the cultural significance of the ground blessing? The true meaning, not the diplomatic description. Catal's scales shifted color slightly, showing discomfort. In ancient times, it was not merely a gesture of respect. It was a ritual of absolute submission, marking the subjugation of a defeated enemy. The 7 heartbeds represent the 7 levels of Ardanian society, with the blessed one acknowledging their place at the bottom. Sarah stood, moving to the pond's edge. Then this isn't just about humiliating Earth's representative. They're trying to establish a legal precedent for treating humanity as a subordinate species under Ardanian law. That would be a concerning interpretation. Catal agreed carefully. As Sarah watched the koi swim in their endless patterns, a plan began forming in her mind. Tell me, Catal, how familiar are you with Earth's diplomatic history? Particularly our protocols regarding sovereign recognition. Catal's scales flickered with interest. I have made a study of your customs, yes. Then perhaps we should discuss how our world's traditions might find common ground. After all, both our species value precision in diplomatic matters. As the artificial sun set in the botanical garden, Ambassador Sarah Chen and Catal began plotting a course that might save the alliance and expose those who sought to destroy it before it began. The hidden truth. The secure conference room deep within Luna's diplomatic quarter hummed with tension. Sarah Chen stood before a holographic display showing intercepted communications between sub-sovereign Valkyr and the Centauri Consortium, her expression grave as she addressed Director Patterson and the Emergency Committee. The pattern is clear, she explained, highlighting specific data streams. Valkyr isn't just trying to subordinate Earth through the ground blessing protocol. He's orchestrating a complete restructuring of interstellar trade routes. Catal, standing tall beside her, added their insight. The consortium has offered Valkyr control over 3 major transit corridors in exchange for ensuring Earth's diplomatic isolation. With humanity classified as a subordinate species, our trade agreements would be invalidated. Patterson leaned forward, his hologram flickering slightly. Can we prove this conclusively? Not yet, Sarah admitted. But we've discovered something else. Catal, show them. The Ardanian diplomat manipulated the holographic controls, bringing up ancient texts. These are the complete records of Protocol 447b, including sections deliberately omitted from the modern diplomatic database. The ground blessing was never meant to be permanent. It was designed as a temporary measure, allowing defeated enemies to demonstrate their willingness to learn and change. The protocol specifically mentions elevation through understanding. Sarah continued. Once the blessing was completed, both parties were meant to rise together, symbolizing mutual growth. Valkyr's faction removed this part from official records during the Conservative Reformation. A murmur ran through the assembled diplomats. Ambassador Rodriguez spoke up first. How did you obtain these records? The Ardanian Historical Archive is supposed to be sealed to off-worlders. Catal's scales shifted to a pattern Sarah had learned to recognize as diplomatic discretion. There are those within the royal court who share my concern about Valkyr's growing influence. They facilitated access. Which brings us to the next part of our plan. Sarah interjected smoothly. We're not just going to counter Valkyr's manipulation of the protocol. We're going to use it to demonstrate exactly why Earth and Ardania need each other. She gestured, and the holographic display changed to show a complex choreography of movements, part traditional Ardanian greeting, part Earth diplomatic protocol. This is what we're calling the elevation ceremony. It incorporates elements from both cultures, emphasizing mutual respect and shared growth. It's unprecedented, Ketal added, their scales now showing excitement. But it's fully compliant with the original protocol's requirements while embodying its true spirit. Patterson studied the display intently. And you believe this will work? It has to, Sarah replied, because we've discovered something else. Ketal. The Ardanian scales darkened. Valkyr plans to use the ceremony to trigger a broader diplomatic crisis. We've uncovered evidence that he's arranged for delegates from 12 other species to be present, species that have their own historical grievances with Ardanian protocols. He's hoping to spark a chain reaction, Sarah explained. Earth's submission or refusal would set a precedent, either weakening multiple species' diplomatic standing or causing a mass withdrawal from Ardanian treaties. Either way, the conservative faction wins. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, Patterson spoke. How much time do we have? The ceremony is in 36 hours, Sarah answered. We need to perfect this new protocol and ensure our evidence is irrefutable. More importantly, we need to convince the High Sovereign to allow this alteration without tipping our hand to Valkyr. Fortunately, Ketal interjected, I have arranged a private audience through channels Valkyr doesn't monitor. The High Sovereign has concerns about the conservative faction's growing influence. Patterson's hologram straightened. You're playing a dangerous game, both of you. If this fails, if we do nothing, humanity's position in interstellar politics will be compromised for generations, Sarah countered. And Ardania will lose its best chance at meaningful cultural exchange and growth. She glanced at Ketal, seeing her own determination reflected in their shifting scales. Very well, Patterson conceded. You have authorization to proceed. But Chen, make sure the evidence against Valkyr is absolute. We can't afford any doubt. As the meeting concluded, Sarah and Ketal returned to their makeshift practice room. They had spent hours perfecting every movement of the elevation ceremony, blending Earth's emphasis on eye contact and measured distance with Ardanian ritual gestures. There's still something missing, Sarah mused, watching their recorded attempts. The protocol mentions 7 stages of understanding, but we're only incorporating 5 distinct movements. Ketal's scales rippled thoughtfully. Perhaps we need to consider not just the physical movements, but the philosophical underpinning of both our cultures' approaches to diplomatic contact. Sarah paused the recording. What do you mean? In Ardanian philosophy, true understanding requires both parties to demonstrate vulnerability while maintaining strength. Your human diplomatic protocols emphasize finding common ground while respecting boundaries. What if we combine these principles? As they discussed the possibilities, Sarah's AI assistant interrupted with an urgent alert. Ambassador, we've detected unusual energy signatures near the Ardanian embassy, similar to Centauri stealth technology. Sarah and Ketal exchanged glances. They're moving faster than we anticipated. Ketal observed, their scales showing concern. Good, Sarah replied, her expression determined. Because so are we. Contact the High Sovereign's private channel. It's time to show our hand, and force Valkyr to reveal his. The royal court. The Ardanian royal palace stretched toward purple skies, its crystalline spires refracting the light of 3 setting suns. Sarah Chen stood at the base of the grand entrance, her diplomatic uniform pristine, her posture steady despite the gravity difference that made every movement a careful calculation. Ketal, now dressed in the formal attire of an Ardanian royal advisor, stood beside her. Their scales had shifted to the deep blues and golds of court ceremony, but Sarah noticed subtle patterns of tension in the iridescent display. The High Sovereign has reviewed our evidence, Ketal murmured, their voice barely audible above the whisper of ionic winds. They will allow the ceremony to proceed as planned. Sarah nodded slightly. And Valkyr, unaware of our private audience, he believes everything proceeds according to his design. The massive doors, carved from ancient petrified trees of Ardania's extinct forests, swung open silently. A procession of court officials emerged, their scale patterns forming complex symphonies of color and meaning. At their head walked sub-sovereign Valkyr himself, his massive frame adorned with the traditional medals of his office. Ambassador Chen. Valkyr's voice resonated with practiced authority. We are honored by Earth's compliance with our most sacred protocols. His scales flickered with what Sarah now recognized as carefully concealed satisfaction. The honor is mutual, sub-sovereign, Sarah replied, executing a perfect Ardanian greeting gesture. Earth values the preservation of cultural traditions, especially those rich with historical significance. Valkyr's outer membranes twitched slightly, the only sign that her emphasis on historical had registered. The delegation representatives await within. Shall we proceed? The great hall of the Ardanian royal court was a marvel of bioengineered architecture. Living crystal formations pulsed with bioluminescence, their patterns shifting in response to the emotional resonance of those present. Sarah noted the representatives from 12 other species positioned strategically around the chamber, just as Ketal had warned. High Sovereign Varan sat upon the crystal throne, their form massive even by Ardanian standards, scales shifting in complex patterns that spoke of centuries of diplomatic experience. Sarah had learned enough from Ketal to read the subtle messages: awareness, calculation, and, most importantly, curiosity. Ambassador Sarah Chen of Earth. Varan's voice filled the chamber without seeming to rise above a conversational tone. You come before us to perform the sacred ground blessing, as dictated by ancient protocol 447b. High Sovereign. Sarah stepped forward, her movements precise. I come before you to honor tradition and forge new understanding between our peoples. Valkyr moved to his position beside the throne, scales showing satisfaction. Then let us proceed with the ancient forms. Ambassador, you will now. If I may, High Sovereign, Sarah interrupted smoothly, causing a ripple of surprise through the assembled dignitaries. In preparing for this ceremony, I have made a study of its true historical significance. She gestured and holographic displays materialized around the chamber, showing the ancient texts Ketal had helped her discover. Protocol 447b speaks not just of submission, but of elevation through understanding. It was designed to transform enemies into allies through mutual growth. Valkyr's scales darkened. These records are sealed. How dare you? They were sealed, the High Sovereign's voice cut through the chamber, by those who sought to twist tradition to their own ends. Their gaze fixed on Valkyr, just as some seek to do today. Sarah continued, her voice clear and steady. In honor of both the protocol's original intent and the future we hope to build, I propose to demonstrate the full ceremony, including the elements of elevation that were obscured during the conservative Reformation. She began to move, her body flowing through the carefully choreographed sequence she and Ketal had developed. Each gesture incorporated elements of both human and Ardanian diplomatic language. The measured eye contact of Earth tradition blended with the scale-like rippling of her uniform's specialized fabric, the precise geometric patterns of her movement echoing ancient Ardanian court dances. The living crystals of the chamber pulsed in response, their light creating patterns that hadn't been seen in the royal court for centuries. The assembled diplomats watched in fascination as Sarah demonstrated how the ground blessing was meant to be performed, not as an act of submission, but as a dance of mutual respect and understanding. Impossible, Valkyr sputtered, his scales showing patterns of rage and fear. This is a mockery of sacred tradition. Is it? Ketal stepped forward, their scales now showing the royal patterns that had been carefully concealed during their time on Luna. Or is it the fulfillment of tradition's true purpose? New holograms appeared, showing intercepted communications between Valkyr and the Centauri Consortium. just as these records show the true purpose of trying to enforce a corrupted version of the protocol. The chamber erupted in a cascade of color as the assembled Ardanian scales reflected shock, anger, and revelation. The representatives of other species began murmuring among themselves, their own diplomatic protocols registering the significance of what they were witnessing. High Sovereign Varen rose from the crystal throne, their massive form towering over the assembly. Their scales shifted through patterns so complex that Sarah could barely follow their meaning, but their voice was clear. "It seems, Ambassador Chen, that you have indeed learned our ways, perhaps better than some who were born to them." The new understanding. The royal court's living crystals pulsed with colors never before seen by human eyes as High Sovereign Varen descended from the crystal throne. The massive Ardanian leader moved with a fluid grace that belied their size, scales shifting through patterns that spoke of ancient authority and modern wisdom. Sub-Sovereign Valkyr, Varen's voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition. "You will explain these communications with the Centauri Consortium." Valkyr's scales had gone almost completely dark, a sign of extreme distress. "My sovereign, these are clearly fabricated. The human ambassador seeks to distract from their obligation to perform the traditional blessing." "The blessing I have already performed," Sarah interjected calmly, "in its complete, original form, as the ancient texts describe it." The chamber's crystals resonated with her words, creating harmonic patterns that seemed to underscore their truth. The assembled diplomatic representatives from 12 species watched intently as the drama unfolded, their own translation devices working overtime to capture every nuance. "Perhaps," Varen suggested, their scales showing a pattern Sarah recognized as judicial consideration, "we should examine all the evidence before us." Kital stepped forward, their royal lineage now evident in every movement. "The evidence exists in 3 forms, High Sovereign. First, the recovered historical texts showing the true nature of Protocol 447b. Second, the intercepted communications proving conspiracy with foreign powers. And third," they paused, scales shifting to a new pattern Sarah had never seen before. "Third," Sarah continued, understanding her cue, "the living memory of your own palace." She gestured to the crystalline walls around them. The bioluminescent patterns had been gradually changing throughout the ceremony, forming increasingly complex geometrical shapes. "These crystals record emotional and historical resonance, do they not? They remember the ceremonies performed here over centuries." Varen's scales showed approval. "Indeed, Ambassador, our living architecture remembers what some would have us forget." They turned to address the assembled diplomats, observe the patterns forming in the crystal matrix. They echo those recorded during the last proper performance of the complete ground blessing, 3 centuries ago. The chamber hummed with energy as the crystal's light coalesced into unmistakable historical records. Holographic figures performed the same ceremony Sarah had just completed, showing how the ritual had originally emphasized mutual growth and understanding rather than submission. Valkyr's composure finally broke. "The old ways must be preserved. Earth's influence grows too quickly. Their innovations spread too fast. They must be contained, controlled. They must be understood." Kital countered, their scales showing royal authority, "just as they seek to understand us." That was the true purpose of Protocol 447b, to transform potential adversaries into knowledgeable allies. High Sovereign Varen raised their hands, and the chamber fell silent. Ambassador Chen has demonstrated not only respect for our traditions, but a deeper understanding of their purpose than many of our own people. In doing so, she has revealed both an attempt to manipulate those traditions and a path forward for genuine cultural exchange. The sovereign scales shifted to formal judgment patterns. "Sub-Sovereign Valkyr, you are relieved of your duties pending a full investigation. The conservative reformation's alterations to our diplomatic protocols will be reviewed and corrected." As royal guards led the disgraced Valkyr away, Varen turned to the assembled diplomatic representatives. "Honored delegates, you were brought here to witness what some hoped would be Earth's submission. Instead, you have seen the birth of a new form of diplomatic engagement, one that honors the past while embracing the future. Sarah stepped forward, her specialized uniform rippling in patterns that matched the Ardanian scales around her. High Sovereign, Earth stands ready to share knowledge and culture with Ardania as equals and allies. The elevation ceremony demonstrates how our differences can strengthen rather than divide us. Indeed, Varen's scales showed a pattern of formal acceptance. Let this day mark not just the signing of a trade agreement, but the establishment of the Interstellar Cultural Exchange Initiative. Each species represented here today is invited to participate in this new framework for diplomatic relations. The chamber erupted in a kaleidoscope of color as Ardanian scales reflected excitement and approval. The other diplomatic representatives began signaling their own interest through various cultural gestures. Later, in a private chamber off the main hall, Sarah and Ketal stood watching the three suns set through a crystalline window. "You knew," Sarah said quietly, "about Valkyr's plan to use the other delegates against us." Ketal's scales showed amusement, just as you knew the living crystals would verify the historical records. We each played our part in bridging our cultures. And now, Ketal replied, their scales shifting to show optimism, we begin the real work of understanding each other. The elevation ceremony was just the first step. Sarah smiled. 7 steps, traditionally, 1 for each level of understanding. Speaking of tradition, Ketal's scales sparkled with humor. I believe Earth has a custom involving the sharing of fermented beverages to celebrate diplomatic victories. We do indeed, Sarah laughed. Though I suspect Ardanian alcohol might have some interesting effects on human physiology. Then perhaps we should start with something milder. After all, Ketal's scales showed the newly created pattern for Earth-Ardanian friendship. We have plenty of time to explore each other's customs properly now. As they watched the last sunset, Sarah reflected on how close they had come to diplomatic disaster, and how the very protocols meant to divide them had instead forged a stronger bond between their peoples. The living crystals around them pulsed softly, recording this moment for future generations to remember.